Well, good morning. I hope you're here because this is the Saturday of our summer school in 2020. And in the program, we wrote the following. Day 3, where do I start? You will have space to clarify your own sense of calling as you ask, what's in my hand and what lies before me. You will then learn how to develop a strategy for your first steps or initiative. And finally, you will explore how to invest in lasting social transformation using the Communities of Reform framework. Now, we wrote that several months ago before we knew we were going to be delivering this summer school virtually online, and so we've got quite a lot less time. We haven't got a whole morning for this, we've just got an hour or two. So what I'm going to do is look mostly at the first part of that, and hopefully you will have heard over the course of the school a bit more about the last part, the Communities of Reform framework. So let's talk first about finding your calling. What is my calling? It is a really big question and a difficult one to answer, but most Christians want to have some sense of what their calling is. They want to know that they are spending their life in a way that pleases God and is aligned with His purposes. So most of us aren't sure because it's not an event. You don't discover your calling through an event normally, although that can be a part of the puzzle. And it's really a sort of a slow revealing, can perhaps take years, a process with different steps. But wherever we are, we want to know, and whatever we're doing, we want to know that God is in it, in that activity or that relationship or that purpose. So let's emphasize too that calling is not only to a purpose or a goal, it's not to an activity, it's also to relationships. And being called to relationships is actually one of the most important aspects of who we are and how to live our lives as Christians. So last year at the summer school, when we had an exercise on this question, we were all asked to write down what we thought our calling or vocation was. So as I thought about it, I thought I can't write down one thing. I feel I have to write down several, and so I wrote these 5 what I'd now call layers of calling. And I said, first of all, I'm called to be a human being. Well, you may think, excuse me, well that isn't optional. But really, if you think about it, the way that God has revealed through, especially the beginnings of Genesis, what a human being is really supposed to be and do, made in the image of the Creator, with the calling or purpose to steward the earth, to fill and subdue it, and to take our place in the creation order. It is a wonderful and an amazing calling, but it's one we need to accept. And so that's the first, if you like, layer of calling. And the most fundamental one is to be a human being, the way that God defines that. Secondly, I wrote down, I'm called to be a child of God and a follower of Jesus. This is the fundamental one for anyone who has become a Christian, who has given their lives over to Christ and to seeking to follow Him right through all of the rest of our days. Thirdly, I'm called to be a husband to Helen and a father to my 5 children. That's a relational calling, it's a lifelong calling. Fourthly, and this is where we tend to talk about what Christians talk about as ministry, I'm called to the area of biblical worldview. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but for the last really sort of 30 years, that has been the number one passion really in my life regarding how I am to serve the wider body of Christ. And lastly, I'm called to lead the Jubilee Centre. And that's the only temporary one of those callings. I'm not sure how long it'll last. It might be for the rest of my life, till I retire, if I retire. But that's my day job. It's the main thing I do right now, is to direct the Jubilee Centre. But it's only one facet of how I understand my calling. So I want us to take a look at the passage around Moses and his calling from the book of Exodus, because I think there's a couple of things that we can really learn from this. So I'm going to read a few verses for you. We haven't got time to read the whole of the narrative around this, which is absolutely fascinating, and probably you know it quite well. So let's begin with Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 to 15. As you know, Moses had been adopted as a baby. Even though he was an Israelite, he was adopted into the family of Pharaoh, the monarch, the ruling family of Egypt, and therefore grew up as a son of the palace in the royal family. So one day, this is Exodus 2, verse 11, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. And then around 40 years then go past, by which time Moses is a shepherd, married to Zipporah, who's the daughter of Jethro. And so we read in Exodus 3, verse 1, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, 'I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up.' When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And Moses said, 'Here I am.' 'Do not come any closer,' God said. 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground.' Then he said, 'I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.' And then God explains how he's heard the misery of his people in Egypt and heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. And I'm concerned about their suffering, God says. And so I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land." And then he says in verse 10, "So now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And then basically the next few verses you see Moses asking a series of questions for clarification perhaps, but you really get the sense that he was trying his best to wriggle out of what God was asking him to do. He really thought he was the wrong man for the job. And then we go on now to Exodus 4, the first few verses. Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you." And then he goes on and finally convinces Moses to take up this job. So let's think a little bit about this passage and what can we learn from it about calling. Well, firstly, the context. The Israelite people had been wronged in so many ways. They had been made into slaves by the Egyptian rulers. Slavery of work, there were physical beatings, they had no rights. Their destiny wasn't one they had chosen, it was one imposed on them by the Egyptian rulers. But God wanted it to be different. But Moses was aware as he grew up that he was actually ethnically part of the group called the Hebrews, who were slaves to the Egyptians. And he began to try and solve the problem in his own strength. He acted as judge, jury, and executioner when he saw an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews. He killed him and tried to address then the next day the argument, the conflict between two of his fellow Hebrews. But of course, he was rumbled, it was found out what he had done, so he flees for his life. And all that education and training in the court of Pharaoh appears to have been wasted. And for 40 years, he ends up as a shepherd. But then there's this sovereign encounter in the desert, the famous one at the burning bush. And there God commissions Moses for the big picture job of getting people out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses was a details man. What if they don't listen? How am I actually going to do it? What's the way? What do I say? What do I do? And that's where God asked him this question. Well, what is in your hand? And of course, what was in his hand was his shepherd's staff. That was his profession, the occupation he had ended up. That's what he was really good at. And Moses then went back to Egypt, not as the estranged son of the palace, but as a shepherd. And he used the instrument of his profession to bring about God's purposes. And we can see this same principle, in a sense, in the lives of other notable biblical characters. They brought their skills and experience, maybe from their profession. They brought what they were really good at into God's purposes, and it became a part of their calling. So Miriam, Moses' sister, is a musician and helped lead the people of Israel in worship as they through the Exodus and afterwards. Joseph brought his skills in management. David's skill with the slingshot, which he learned also as a shepherd. Nehemiah's skill in palace administration, he learned in the court of Artaxerxes, the Persian. Daniel was skilled in cultural studies. Paul's training in theology and philosophy. Think of Luke, the doctor's attention to detail and his compassion and concern for people, shown in the way he included women and men, young and old, rich and poor in his gospel. So we can look at this a little bit as a metaphor, this idea of what's in your hand. God tends to use the things you are good at in his service. That is the principle. That our calling is not normally to something we have never done before, we're no good at, that is completely strange to us. God works through our lives and over the course of our lives to equip us with the kind of skills and aptitudes which he wants to use in his service and for the kingdom. So then comes the second question. What is in your heart? Now, Moses had a heart for justice and for advocacy, you could say. He wanted to rescue his people, but he went about it the wrong way. He squandered, he thought, his chance. And even acting unjustly himself, perhaps, he was aware that he had blown it and he'd become like the oppressor himself. The very people he was wanting to oppose, he had ended up like them. He loses all his confidence. But God revived that sense of calling in Moses' heart, even though he felt entirely inadequate as a leader, which is actually one of the qualities God looks for in leaders. People who think they are really good at leadership are perhaps the ones that God needs to take away for a while, go through a desert, the school of hard knocks, until we are brought to that place of humility, of aware of our weaknesses, of real dependence on God, but at the same time, bringing our strengths into God's service. Many years ago, when I did a discipleship training school in Youth of the Mission, I remember one of the teachers there one week saying, defining meekness, and meekness, because it says elsewhere that now Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. You kind of think, well, our idea of meekness is a rather weak and insipid kind of character, but actually meekness, when you look at Moses, this guy said, was strength in the control of the master. And the same word or root word apparently is used for breaking in a wild horse so that it will accept a bridle. And So there's a sense in which meekness is when you bring all the strengths you have and you submit them in service to a master. So that's what Moses did. So for us, we can ask these two questions. Firstly, what is in your heart? What concerns you? What are you passionate about? Now, I wish there was a different word for that. We overuse that phrase these days. If you're passionate about this, that, or the other. And it's lost a lot of its value, but it's still a really important concept. And as I said before, in my life, it's been my passion, if you like, is for biblical worldview. What does that mean? It's a passion for seeing God's perspective transform the way we think about our work, our academic discipline, or our profession, or the industry we're a part of. A realization that everything can be done for the glory of God. And in the Jubilee Centre's offices, in our lounge there, which we have for many events, up on the wall there, written in Latin so that people don't accuse us of preaching, is a great big Bible verse, which is Romans 12 verse 2, which of course it says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you can test and approve God's will, his good, pleasing and perfect will. So that's the process really of being renewed entirely, all of our lives brought into line with God's revelation and truth, that biblical worldview. So for me, that's my sense of what I'm passionate about, what's in my heart. And then secondly, what is in your hand? What are you good at? In what areas are you genuinely better than others? And of course there are various tests and questionnaires that you can use to find this out, but also ask people who know you well and who will be honest with you and say what you are good at, and also perhaps what you're not so good at if you think that you are. Think of the great commandment, which is to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength. So our talents or our what we're good at could be across a wide range of things. You may be skilled practically. You may excel academically. You may be emotionally intelligent. That doesn't always go with the one I just said before. You may be artistically gifted. You may have a lot of common sense and be a really reliable all-round player. But the key thing is, what is in your hand? What are you good at? I love watching the Canet Mason family, and if you saw the video last night of this family playing together, they are all, these 7 children in this family are all absolute prodigies, fantastically good musically, but the ability of them to play together as a family and create something so beautiful and so rich is, I find, deeply moving. And they're using that gift, and in the film last night, they were using it as a black family, highly gifted in classical music. They're making an amazing statement about how black lives really do matter. And it was a beautifully stated, quiet resistance, if you like, to how racism is really destroying so many things in our life and our society. So a wonderful example of them using what they're really good at to make a statement. I don't know if they're Christians or not, but they are advocating for truth and for justice in a brilliant way. So we want to, as we go forward, thinking about calling, consider those 2 questions carefully as a way to cast more light on what God is calling you to do with your life. And it is likely that that calling will be aligned with what is in your heart and will draw on what is in your hand. Well, that's the end of the first part, and I'm going to just pause and invite my wife Helen to come in and join me for the second part of this talk. Thanks.